These are some ideas for developing mixed media techniques using mark making and mixed media over your collage. It's always best to practice any techniques, so you can see here I'm playing around with mark making, starting off darker and closer around the edge and making those marks further apart as they disperse from the object. By doing this, it creates contrast. It also makes the object appear as if it's further forward, as the darkness and the texture behind it push it forward in relation to that. We're making these marks with biro or a non-water based pen, so that when we colour wash over later on with wet media, the pen marks and the textures don't run. You can see on this spiral design I've tried to develop the same idea, layering up different coloured biro pens and different types of marks and patterns. When adding colour, I've used a light watercolour to go over the top of the marks. Then when it's dry, I've used a contrasting colour on the flatter areas. When we use watercolours or inks, there are two different ways we can do this. The first one is known as the wet in wet technique, and we put water or a colour wash of a light colour down first. Whilst it is still wet, we can then start to add a darker colour, maybe around the edges, and the water helps the colours mix and disperse. This creates subtle blends and is a little bit less controlled than some of the wet on dry techniques, but leaves a very, very different type of effect. When we work next to a wet area, there's a chance that the colours will run and mix together. So we've got to plan what we're doing quite carefully when we're working with wet media. The other way to do this is to do what's called a wet on dry technique. So you have the dry paper and go in with the darker paint, say around the edges. Before that paint or ink dries, you add water and gradually work the colour through so it gradually disperses, getting lighter as it comes along. Whilst it's still wet at this stage, if you do want to create an ombre effect, you can bring in a lighter colour and blend those using the wet in wet technique. You may not want to do this, but it is just another way of approaching it. For more defined areas with crisper edges and bolder colours, you would just paint your ink or your watercolour straight onto the paper, making sure that you left it to dry for that crisp edge before you worked anywhere near it. You can see I'm filling in different areas and leaving plain areas with no paint on initially so that they can be drying before I come back to work with them. That way it keeps the areas defined and they don't bleed and run together. Like we would use directional marks with our pencil crayon, we would do the same with our paint. In a normal situation, I would actually turn my book around and be painting towards myself in one direction, but because of the camera, I've had to keep it in one position whilst we did the filming. Remember, we can create contrast through the texture and the lack of texture, through the warm and the cool colours, through the wet in wet technique and the wet in dry technique. There are lots of different areas that you can develop in different ways. So if you've got any coloured inks or watercolours at home and you want to have a go, think about how and where you'd apply yours.